Bill, Fletcher, and Asbjørn Wahl. Would you like to join us?
Sorry? I want to stand up for this. I hope that's okay. Yeah.
All right. Good. Well, then I invite you to our first main session. As you can see from the program, it's a plenary presentation first, and then we break up in discussion groups, and so that we have the time to discuss in small groups what we have been told by our two speakers and perhaps other questions that arise. I would like you to keep to the time of 20 minutes if possible, so that we do have enough time to just put questions to them here in the plenary to understand, to make sure that we understand what they mean, and then we can break up in discussion groups. So I'd like to pass the word to Asbjørn Wahl.
He's first.
Oh, he's first. Okay, then first Bill Fletcher, American Federation of Government Employees. Please, Bill.
Thank you. Should I?
Is that okay here? Or would you like to have it over there?
No, it's fine.
It's fine.
With it,
Well,
so.
don't touch it. Okay.
Can we turn the camera off for 1 second?
Mm-hmm. Hey, camera's off.
So good afternoon. Between roughly the hours of 1300 and 1700, history, you know. Ready?
Ready?
Rock and roll?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So again, good afternoon. I want to start with my assessment of the moment in which we find ourselves. I do not mean by this this particular day, week, month, or year. Rather, I'm referencing the conjuncture. It is a conjuncture that is represented by the rise to hegemony of finance capital and the dominance of the neoliberal economic and political framework. It is also a period from which we must exit by going forward. There is no rear exit, at least none that is progressive. It is along the lines of those tire traps that let you go forward but not reverse without destroying your tires altogether. During the period of 1975 to 85, global capitalism underwent a very fundamental reorganization. Those of us who were of age at the moment, and particularly those of us who were trade union activists, felt it in our bones the way that someone can often sense a pending storm. There has been an ongoing debate regarding the emergence of neoliberal globalization, and specifically this question of globalization. Let us be clear that capitalism as a system has always been global. You can ask any of us who are descendants of those who were removed from Africa and were transported to the New World. Ask anyone who was a descendant of Native Americans who were invaded, had their land seized, and the riches of their earth plundered, and used to subsidize the rise of contemporary European capitalism, a point that Marx and Engels made so clearly and actually passionately in the 19th century. And of course, at the end of the 19th century and leading up to World War I, there was extensive international trade and investment. Yet something happened in the 1975-85 period that was deeper and more profound than simply a retread of the past. One way to look at what we experienced was the exposure of the rabidity of capitalism, but this time in the global north. As Samir Amin noted, accumulation by dispossession, the modus operandi of neoliberal globalization, made primitive accumulation permanent. While we did not witness the introduction of a new social system, we did witness a change in the manner in which capitalism came to operate. The features of this have become well known: financialization, which we discussed earlier, casualization, privatization, deregulation, and deunionization. There are two specific features of this moment that I wish to highlight. One, the emergence of a transnational capitalist class that operates through nation states, and two, the obliteration of any notion of a social contract or historic compromise between capital and the working class. The construction of a transnational capitalist class has been one of the most profound developments of our time. We're talking about a shift away from contending empires and something more akin to struggles within an oligarchy. Please understand, I'm not suggesting a rootless empire along the lines of Hart and Negri and their thesis. I am also not suggesting that the nation state has outlived its usefulness. Actually, the nation state is every bit as important as ever. Yet its role has been undergoing a change as we have seen the construction of a transnational capitalist class, a class built through the evolution of multinational corporations into transnational corporations and through the transnationalization of finance. This issue of the transnational capitalist class becomes very critical when we explore matters of strategy and the legitimacy of the state, and I'll come back to that. One specific point that must be emphasized and made forcefully and clearly by our comrade Sam Gindin and his colleague and friend Leo Panage is that the United States serves as the principal repressive arm of global capitalism. Always operating in the singular interests of the U.S. Crisis within the leadership of the trade union movement. Most of the current leadership of the trade union movement in the global north emerged in the context of some notion of a social contract, be it the social democratic welfare state or some other similar understanding. The rise of neoliberal globalization has meant a full-blown assault on the working class and its various organizations and institutions. It seeks to eliminate any and all opposition to the accumulation of profits. This is what has made the repeated search for a new social contract or social compact completely fruitless. Global capitalism has no interest in such a compromise. It seeks our annihilation. This is the case be it in the United States, the Philippines, Greece, or Egypt. This realization is much too scary for most trade union leaders because it calls into question their roles, strategies, and forms of organization with which they are most comfortable. It also means that our movement runs the risk of being declared illegitimate, to be the riffraff, the many-headed hydra, as it were. We stand at the intersection of three major crises, all overdetermined. An economic crisis that represents a crisis of overaccumulation and financial speculation. An environmental crisis that threatens life on this planet and is only one part of it being climate change. The environmental crisis is directly related to the capitalist mode of production, and in that sense is not simply or mainly a matter of technology. It is a matter of choices, and choices that flow from the form of accumulation and the corresponding priorities of capitalist society. The third crisis is the one that I raised earlier in my talk, the crisis of the legitimacy of the state. To be clear, this in no way is to suggest that the masses are prepared to storm the barricades. Rather, neoliberal globalization and the rise of a transnational capitalist class have together created a legitimacy question that the capitalist class is trying desperately to resolve. Let me explain it in this way. The rise of the transnational capitalist class and the polarization of wealth and resources under neoliberalism means that there is less for the majority. Neoliberalism has carried out a frontal assault on the public sector, in fact, strangling the public sector through tax cuts and privatization. With fewer resources, intense competition emerges over what does exist. This competition can result in genocide, for example, Rwanda, or milder but no less ominous right-wing populist movements. The bullseye ends up being on who can be described as the other, and thereby reasonably excluded from the proceeds of society. We need to unpack this for a moment. The countries of the global north have not only had an imperial relationship to those of the global south, but also to the migrants from the global south who have moved north. With the economic reorganization of global capitalism, there have been major changes in the entire process of work, including where things are produced and how. With a weakening living standard, workers in the global north feel their imperial prerogative appearing to disappear. While they continue to have a relatively advantageous position vis-a-vis immigrant workers from the global south or indigenous populations and or the formerly enslaved populations, the mere presence of these black populations reminds the so-called native or white workers of the decline in their living standard. And by the way, when I use the term black, I'm doing so in the spirit of Steve Biko, who suggested that black was less a color and more of a relationship to global white supremacy. The transnational capitalist class does not respond to this concern. It is not focused on the conditions of specific working classes, except and insofar as it must. All of the fuel, therefore, is necessary for intense resentment to build up. The other aspect of the legitimacy crisis concerns the fact that with the transnational capitalist class operating through nation states, the individual nation states are less and less responsive to the popular demands. This helps us understand how it is that so frequently allegedly progressives and sometimes allegedly leftist parties and movements can be elected or lifted into office only to advance and enforce policies that seem to be diametrically opposed to what they campaigned upon. Such a reality promotes broad cynicism and a sense of alienation at the base. The state seems to be out of touch with the masses, unresponsive to their demands. This disconnect creates a series of additional problems for the transnational capitalist class and their domestic representatives. For one, if the state is not responsive to the needs of the electorate, does something need to be done about not only those elected, but the form of governance? This can be answered with a leftist or rightist bent. I'll get back to that. Do we need to retreat into various forms of right-wing populist nationalism, or proceed forward with a left progressive or outright leftist internationalism? The right-wing populists further ask, if the state is not responsive, do we need to take a turn away towards smaller states that will protect the benefits of a particular segment of the larger population? 2-3 mini Kosovos, for example. Do we need to go further and outright exclude or annihilate competitor populations? Thus, and quite paradoxically, while wealth is polarizing at an unprecedented scale, while a smaller and smaller class of people are coming to dominate human affairs, the nature of neoliberal globalization is turning populations against one another, including populations that historically work together in relative harmony. Fewer and fewer institutions seem to exist that can address this barbarization, which of course is why the very actuality of a labor movement, broadly defined, is so critical. In this period of what has been called the empire of chaos, one must understand that there are genuine and false responses. Specifically, there are genuine forms of anti-capitalism, while at the same time on the political right there are very dangerous and false prophets of anti-capitalism. And let me spend a few minutes on that. I always like to say that right-wing populism is the herpes of capitalism. It is in the system, and when the body's resistance is down, it emerges. Right-wing populism is not an aberration from capitalist politics. It is a tendency that's very much a part of the system. But when the system weakens, such as times of economic crises, Right-wing populism in its various forms, including fascism, surfaces with a vengeance. It is important in moments such as this one to understand that the political right is far from monolithic. In fact, the tendencies that we see in virtually all so-called democratic capitalist states toward the state moving rightward and in an authoritarian direction are not at all the same as right-wing social movements, though of course there is a relationship. Neoliberalism is bringing with it an increasingly neoliberal authoritarian state. As a transnational capitalist class finds it more and more difficult to reign based on mass legitimacy, it finds itself turning towards mechanisms of repression. Such mechanisms are not necessarily and openly violent, at least at first appearance. They can include a narrowing of the parameters of what is considered legitimate political activity. The violence can be implicit rather than explicit. This is not to suggest that capitalism can no longer grant reforms, particularly economic reforms. Rather, there is an intransigence within capital, given that they believe that they do not have to. And there is no sense of accountability. While, as William Robinson points out, transnational capitalism may be the dominant fraction of capital, transnational capital does not hold hegemony in the sense of anything approaching a popular acceptance of its leadership and the current form of accumulation. This neoliberal authoritarian state does need a mass base, but this mass base is seen as an instrument for their rule rather than any attempt to radically terminate or replace the formal structure of the democratic capitalist state, with an emphasis on the formal structure. Right-wing and left-wing responses to this have emerged. The right-wing responses, while sometimes being appendages of particular capitalists or segments of capital, must be understood as mass movements. In fact, movements of very bad people. What is particularly dangerous is that some of these mass movements are using the language, forms of organization, and sometimes even the imagery of the left in order to advance their causes. Actually, this should not surprise us. Right-wing populism and particularly fascism are radical movements in their own way. They're not the same as a military coup regime, for example. Out-of-power right-wing populism and its fascist variant seeks to build a movement that challenges the very essence of democratic capitalism, frequently exposing all or most of the hypocrisy of the system. Think about the Italian fascists or the German Nazis in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Though neither was based within the working class, they both had some working class support and presented themselves on occasion as being above the left-right dichotomy. The Nazi flag, for instance, was in part designed to appeal to those who were sympathetic to the left. They seek to burn away the deadwood that is accumulated within contemporary capitalism in order that new trees within an altered and non-democratic capitalism may sprout. Japanese fascism, though having a very different historical foundation, presented itself as a radical force. In this case, their radicalism was alleged anti-imperialism, more appropriately understood as anti-Western imperialism, but pro-Japanese imperialism. Much like today's Al-Qaeda, their rhetoric skewered the West for its various crimes against Asia, but its program was nothing approaching progressive. Today's right-wing response to the crisis of capitalism is not fundamentally different. Appealing to workers in the middle strata whose lives are collapsing, their rhetoric mixes anti-globalization with anti-corporate, only to throw in a little anti-Semitism, racism, misogynism, and xenophobia. In almost all cases, right-wing populists promote myths about the past, recalling days gone by that actually never existed. The left's response to the crisis of capitalism has been hamstrung by the crisis of socialism, a crisis that has affected all trends within the left. The crisis of the Soviet bloc, China, social democracy, and the national populist projects in the global south have contributed to strategic and visionary confusion and paralysis, despite sometimes successful efforts at left and socialist renewal. While there are left voices in some left organizations suggesting a way out of the crisis, entire sections of the left, particularly Western social democracy in the form of communist parties of the Soviet bloc, have found themselves trying to legitimate neoliberalism, or at least softening the blows of neoliberal globalization. I cannot go into a full analysis of the crisis of socialism today, though I'd love to discuss it with everyone over a drink. What I will say is that the weakness of the left has contributed to the crisis facing the global trade union movement. the absence of a left alternative that is present in order to advance a strategy that ultimately aims to achieve a post-capitalist, revolutionary, socialist, democratic objective has meant that much of the trade union movement has not only found itself plateauing, but worse, fighting a permanent rearguard action that has resulted in what South Korean theorist Lee Byung-hun has described as interest group socialism, with the corresponding breakdown of any semblance of solidarity. Thus, for those of us on the left, the task of rebuilding the global trade union movement and actually transforming it into a global labor movement is inseparable from the task of rebuilding the left. It is not that one follows the other. The tasks have to go on simultaneously. Rebuilding the left is about both the building of organizations that are an expression of the left, as well as building components of a broader popular democratic bloc that seeks to fight for power. So let us turn to the question then of the trade union movement. What needs to be said has largely been said, and I don't mean just here. The movement in the global north is largely stuck. Within the global south, there remain key examples of renovation and experimentation. Globally, however, the movement is stuck in two old paradigms. Many of the unions that have been associated with the ITUC have variations on the theme of corporatist trade unionism, specifically the view, and I would call it a prayer, for the reestablishment of tripartism. For many of the unions of the World Federation of Trade Unions, there's a variation on revivalism and nostalgia for the rhetoric of the Soviet bloc and a caricature of class struggle, without an appreciation of the existing conjuncture and the total reshaping of the class struggle that we've experienced over the last 30 years. As unions find themselves under the gun of neoliberal globalization, the retreat into interest group unionism, or in the US, I call it Gompersism, means not only a retreat from the actuality of the class struggle, but a retreat from any conception of unions having a social mission that goes beyond the limits of those it directly represents. In this period of semi-barbarism, this is most dangerous, since unions specifically and labor more generally can be a civilizing and educational force in the midst of the empire of chaos. Unions can and should serve as an organizing committee for the larger popular democratic bloc. No, not replacing a political party or parties, but as the major social force exerting a gravitational pull on other progressive social movements. In order for this to occur, we must insist upon a badly needed labor reformation, to borrow from the words of my late friend Jerry Tucker, a one-time leader of a reform movement of the United Auto Workers. This means the reconceptualization of trade unionism to fit into what I've termed social justice unionism, a unionism that, while conducting and advancing class struggle domestically, must be operating simultaneously at an international level, including within the context of existing nation states. Labor reformation focused on constructing social justice unionism and the building of a popular democratic bloc does not aim to turn unions into political parties. I emphasize this again because I have seen in various parts of the world, in a response to the crisis facing the left, leftists entering into labor unions and attempting to get them to operate as if they are themselves political parties. This is dangerous and sectarian, since unions are united fronts of workers within which struggle takes place over a myriad of issues and directions. The left must fight to win over workers rather than administratively hijack them. In shifting unions towards social justice unionism, we are suggesting that the union must take a different role in the 21st century. They are to play a major role in a profoundly political and economic struggle with the dominant forces in capitalist society, whereas the fight is actually for power and the restructuring of the state and society. The sorts of reforms for which we must fight have at one point been considered radical or revolutionary, but today they have come to be more common sense, whether they focus on housing, healthcare, economic development, taxes, the environment, or foreign policy. For any of this to happen, however, it is not just the election of new leaders with new rhetoric, but a struggle which we must engage within our ranks, a struggle that includes a significant education and debate, such that there is an actual and verifiable mandate for the sorts of changes, indeed transformations, that are necessary in order to respond to the urgency of labor reformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Thank you.
Very nice timekeeping as well.
Thank you.
Very interesting talk, I think, to discuss in the discussion groups. And I pass on to Asbjørn Wahl from the Norwegian Union of Municipal and General Employees. And maybe you can move a bit more.
You want to try all this? Yeah. Which one? You put it on. Is it in here? This one? Yeah. Use that one. Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. And since I've had the pleasure to have Bill going first and giving you this very broad and general picture of the situation we are in, it gives me an opportunity to rather go into some few issues and elaborate them more in depth that we have had the chance to do so far. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to, what is it?
Oh, sorry.
There we are. So I'm going to focus on four main issues. First of all, some thoughts about the connection between capitalism, globalization, crisis, and neoliberalism. Just some few words, because I want to have some of the points included in the discussion that follows, because what I've experienced in the discussion in the trade union movement. The second one, maybe the biggest one, is what I call the ideological legacy of the social pact, or then how to understand the social partnership ideology, because I think it's not only to talk about it, but we have to understand why this developed and why it is still so deeply rooted in the trade union movement, particularly in Europe, I think, but it has spread all over the world. And the third issue I want to address is the need to politicize the trade unions. And the reason for that, one of the most important reasons for that, is that the political parties have let us down so awfully over the last years. And my fourth and last issue will be just a short conclusion of the all, the need to radicalize our messages and to develop our struggle to match our adversaries, because that is the challenge we face in the current situation. So let me, why doesn't it work?
There.
There it is.
You have to press this.
This one.
Yeah.
Okay. There it is. Work. There we are. So about neoliberalism and the crisis, if this won't work. A lot of people are in the trade union movement, a lot of discussion I've been involved in over the last 20 years, they think and believe and argue that neoliberalism created the economic crisis. I think that's wrong. I think quite the opposite, which is the situation. The crisis created the need for the neoliberal ideology. It was the crisis of capitalism that started the whole thing. And the neoliberal ideology was taken as the ideology of capitalists as a response to the crisis. This works very badly. It was the internal contradiction of capitalism which started the whole thing. But there is another important development in this, and because neoliberalism won hegemony in very short time. In 10 years' time, neoliberalism was the hegemonic ideology worldwide. after the 1980s. So the second reason why that was so easy was the lack of resistance from the trade union and the labor movement. It was a march forward for capitalists without meeting almost any resistance in the situation. And then we have this crisis of overaccumulation, underconsumption, or whatever people call it. But anyway, what took place was a considerable redistribution from wages to profits, which played a decisive role for the development of the financial crisis that we have. Oh. And purchasing power became too weak to buy all the goods and services which were or could be produced if they used all the capacity of the production apparatus. So this was partly compensated, then, this lack of purchasing power, through increased loaning, which together with massive speculation resulted in this gigantic financial bubble that we have been through. And this is part of this, what earlier today was called this war on workers, which is going on. This war on workers covers everything. Social benefits, the right to organize, the right to strike, and all this. And this is the wage share in the European 15, that is the member state that has been the longest, in the US, in Japan, and in Germany. As you see, from 1975 quite up to today, it has been a continuous reduction of the wage share of value added in the production. So this has been a quite stable development all the way. So this war on workers works, in other words. On the other hand, the amount of financial capital in the world has exploded in the same period. From 1980 to 2006, where the blue graphs here are the total financial assets in the world in this period, how it has increased, and the gray ones are the gross national product globally. So we see there has been a sort of an explosion in financial assets and surplus of financial capital, which is hunting for profitable investment. And that is sort of driving the enormous need for expansion of capitalism. It's a desperate hunt for profitable investments going on. And that is also the most important reason and the underlying driving force behind the privatization of public services, because the most important thing in this privatization process is to make it into profit-producing entities. And this has created also this enormous surplus of capital, created also this unparalleled financial speculation, and what some people call globalization. And I still hear this globalization spoken of in a way which, from somebody at least, present globalization as a law of nature. It is something that has come there. We can't avoid it. It is part of the necessary development. And I think that is a problem which big parts of the trade union movements have been fighting with for a long time. But globalization is not a law of nature. It's the result of deregulation of all markets and capital strategy for expansion. That is what is included, mainly in the notion of globalization. So that was just the points I wanted to include in the discussion. First and foremost, I think this that it is the crisis of capitalism itself that is the driving force, and not neoliberalism that has created the crisis. The second point is this ideological legacy of the social pact, or the social partnership ideology. And this social partnership ideology, which has developed in the trade union and labor movement, is a true-born child of the class compromise. It is the class compromise which created these this ideology. And another thing that this development is the development of a very specific historic development. The class compromise, the way it developed in the last century, was highly specific, in which the balance of power shifted towards labor. The balance of power is decisive in understanding the social partnership ideology and the class compromise. And what happened, I'm not going to go deeply into it, but the capitalists in the last century during this development felt the interest threatened, and that is the deciding phenomenon, because it was that they felt the interest threatened by strength of the trade unions and labor movement, including everything from the Russian Revolution and so on, the strengthening of the trade unions, the radicalization of trade unions in Europe, that made that the capitalists felt the interest threatened. And it was this threat that made them give in to workers' demands to damp the radicalism of workers. Capitalism are always interested in entering into compromises if the alternative is worse, is seen to maybe worse. That's also what was illustrated earlier today when we talked about the ILO. The ILO as a tripartite institution was created exactly immediately after the Russian Revolution, because the capitalist on the world scale was afraid of the development which spread from Russia, and they were very, very eager at that time to go into a tripartite cooperation, because they used that cooperation to damp the radicalism of the working class. Another element, but linked, of course, to this class struggle, is that the social partnership ideology that the capitalist was interested in and the states was interested in developing this two- and three-partite cooperation was also because they needed popular support in West in the Cold War against Soviet Union. And this contributed in the same direction, made the possibility, opened the possibility for a social partnership. And the result of that development was, at least in big parts of Europe, in Northern and Western Europe most, but also in the South, and I think also it's spread to many other parts of the world, we got at least 20 years of unprecedented social progress in Europe. And this, of course, influenced the consciousness and the thinking of people in this situation, because they lived in a society in which social progress was part of development. I was myself part of this. I came from a poor background in Norway and was part of this social progress that just continued year after year. And when we thought about the future, we thought about the future as a better place to be, because that was what we learned through the development we saw around us. And this, of course, influenced very strongly the thinking of people, the consciousness of people. So what happened, I think, what happened during this period was that social progress was less and less seen as a result of certain power relations in society, but it was considered to be the compromise itself, the situation with social peace and social dialogue which led to social progress. That is, I think, is the mix of causes and effects that developed during this period and formed part of the consciousness of the working class, and not least the labor bureaucracy, which was strongly involved in this two-partite, three-partite cooperation. But the other side of this development was that it contributed to depoliticizing, de-radicalizing, and demobilizing the working class and the trade unions. And that started early in this phase. So when we came to the crisis in the 1980s, it was already, the working class and trade union movement was already depoliticized and de-radicalized. So that was one of the reasons, I think, that there was no strong response to the enormous attacks that started to come in the 1980s. And another important thing to note in this development was that this historic development itself changed the character of social democratic parties. Social democratic parties started off as mass workers' organizations fighting for socialism. Because socialism was there. We can discuss or disagree and agree with the reformist way to socialism, but what the organizations were, they were mass workers' organization fighting for socialism. What happened during this social partnership period was that the Labour Party changed from being mass organization into being mediators between the classes in order to solve the problems peacefully. So they stopped being a mass organization and a class organization and became a mediator between them. And I think that is quite important in order to understand the consciousness that is developed in the Labour Party bureaucracies and trade union bureaucracies. So let me just also give you sort of picture of what happened in this period, because some very important things happened in order to curb the power of private capital actually in this period of class compromise. If we look at the private capital, what's happened in the post-war period was that this private capital, the power of this private capital was curbed actually in society by somewhat ring-fencing private capital by regulation. And it was done this way: trade protectionism, capital control, fixed exchange rates, regulation of investments and banks and financial institutions, labor legislation and collective agreements, and an increasing and growing public sector. So all these things developed in Western Europe, Northern Europe, and most of Europe in the post-war period, and it influenced the social development, and it was the basis of this restriction on private capital that it was possible for these states to develop a welfare state, a social progress. Without this, it wouldn't have been possible. So the turning point in this development happened, of course, in the 1970s with crisis once again coming back, the triumph of neoliberalism and the following restructuring of global capitalism, the deregulation, abolishment of capital control, immense shift in the balance of power, because as I said in brackets here, and it's all about power, stupid, the breakdown of the class compromise which took place in this period. So if we look at this model once more, see what happened from 1980 up to the end of the 1990s was the following. And it happened very fast, and it happened almost without any discussion and almost without mobilization of counter forces. It just happened. Neoliberalism ruled, and it took place, and the labor movement was not able to mobilize. So what was it that went wrong in a period in which people were used to social progress and experience social development? Well, there are a number of points which are important to understand that. One is that social pact was not a stable situation in the first place. It can never be. A compromise between social forces can never be a stable situation. It is almost per definition a short-term development. And it was a compromise in a very concrete historic situation, and the historic situation changed, as we know. It was from the beginning a tactical compromise. Also from the labor movement was a tactical compromise. From the other side, I'm sure that all the time they have been quite sure of that. But in the labor movement, this tactical compromise gradually became the final aim. To defend the welfare state was the final aim of the labor and trade union movement in Europe. So they gave up the previous aim, which was socialism. But the problem was that basic power relation as ownership to capital and all this kind remained intact. So that the power, the possibility to hit back when the situation was right was there, and as we know, it was used when it was possible to use it. And the ideological social pact de-radicalized, as I said, and the trade union labor movement was taken by surprise by the neoliberal offensive when it came in the 1980s. So, same figure but new title. This was just not enough. And that is important to note, I think, when we learn today that the ETUC, the European Trade Union Confederation, the main aim of that organization today is to re-establish a social compact. That means to re-establish a class compromise, to go back, I think they long back to the 1950s and 60s. That's the problem. But there is nothing in the situation that makes it possible for such a compromise now. The balance of power is completely different. There is no possibility to do that. So not even this very strict regulation of capital, which we had most strongly developed in the Nordic countries in Europe, was not enough in order to secure social progress. So what was lacking was that if we are going to go further in another situation, we have to discuss the question of ownership, we have to discuss the question of democratic control, and we have to realize that we have to be able to mobilize enormously social power in order to change this, because it is the center of this figure which is creating the problem. So the big question which you can discuss in the working groups and so on, and in the discussion is, in retrospect, if we look back to today, the welfare state in Europe has been celebrated as the great achievement of the trade union labor movement in Europe. But if we today honestly look back on it, on what's happened, and see what has happened over the last few years, who gained the most from the class compromise and the resulting welfare state? I think that is a question we should deal with and try to give an answer to. Okay, my third point is that the need to politicize the trade unions as the political parties have let us down so awfully. And the labor movement is in crisis. It's a deep political ideological crisis of the left. I explained one of the reasons why that is the situation in the labor parties, social democratic parties, but we have almost no system criticism in these parties today. There are few attempts, not only from the labor parties and social democracy, but also to the parties to the left of social democratic parties, and also the trade union movements. There are very few attempts at mobilizing for a power struggle. There is no efforts to curb the power of financial capital. And if you think, if you noted the same as I did in 2008 when the financial crisis came over from USA to Europe in a way, there were sort of a nervosity in the situation. A lot of governments and also big companies and capitalists were sort of nervous what would happen, and they started to talk about the necessity to regulate financial economy and financial market and so on, and to regulate the banks and financial institutions. But since there was no resistance and no struggle and no fight launched from the labor movement, there was no necessity to do that. So they forgot about it, and almost nothing had happened after that. And that's because there is no resistance. Even the Social Democrats themselves realize in short periods that they have big internal problems. And I think there's this quotation from a book published by Social Democrats themselves in something called the Social Europe Journal, The Future of European Social Democracy. When they launched this book 2 years ago, they wrote, among other things, in the last decade, European social democracy has ceased to be about either society or democracy. In government, it has embraced liberal economic principles that undermine solidarity and association. Along the way, the idea of the common good has been lost, and there is no vision of a good society. That's quite a description of a political project which they are members of. So is there an alternative solution then? The crisis, I think that there are enormous potential if we want to fight. The crisis has discredited this system. and it should have given us an opportunity to disarm financial capital and regulate the markets. The public sector could be used rather than to be cut, should be used to damp the effects of the crisis and stabilize the economy. We need a radical redistribution of wealth in society, and I think it is mass support of that in society. We don't use it. Only the trade union movement has the potential to push solutions in this direction I've written here. But potential is one thing, practice something else. And we need a change of the unions and a structuring of them and a refocusing of them. And we do have competitors on the market. So that's a big problem. And the thing is that the capitalist crisis creates a real basis for alienation, exclusion, discontent, and polarization. And workers in the situation, that is created in a situation in which workers feel betrayed by their own politicians, by the labor parties and parties to the left. On the other hand, the extreme right support absolutely all discontent among people. The thing is that they channel it in what I call perverted political directions. The only alternative to this, of course, is a policy of the left which politicizes the discontent and channels it into real fights for collective solutions. And I think what we need to do with the trade union movement, if we want to attack capitalism of today, which is in its most destructive period almost at any time, we have to have, first of all, we have to have an understanding of the situation. That is being done at this course. That is excellent. A system critical view. And we have to build new broad social alliances. We have to develop concrete alternatives. But also, due to the party political misery we face, trade unions themselves must take a broader political responsibility. That is my view. That does not mean that we should change the trade unions into political parties. Far from that. But it means that trade unions should take a much broader social responsibility for the struggle we are in. Solidarity and to restructure of the unions. Last but not least, the need to radicalize our message and to develop our struggle to master adversaries. We have to understand also that the welfare state and the social progress we experienced in the post-war period was not the emancipation of labor, of workers. It was a compromise. It was based on a compromise, and the welfare state also reflected the mixed interest in the compromise. So the positive effects of a class compromise can never be more than a temporary achievement. A compromise is a compromise and breaks down when the power relations shift. Emancipatory social policies presuppose a huge shift in the balance of power in society, of course. And today, the situation is that we demand too little and accept too much. As authoritarian rule and oppression increase, our response has to be bolder and much more radical than today. And the worse the situation is, the more radical must the answer be. Because people are fed up and they leave us in favor of the right wing if we don't do anything. And as an example, if the right to strike is restricted or banned, which they are doing in Europe now, in many countries, they are restricting the right to demonstrate, the right to strike and so on. We have to win back the right in practice by doing it, by going on strike. That was the way we won the right to strike from the very beginning, and we have to do it again. That one of the most important strikes we had in Norway in 1928 was exactly that. The construction workers was stopped by law by the government, and they continued to strike for months. And they won, and nobody was sacked. So I have tried to come up with a minimum program in order to fight capitalism. And it will not now. Fight austerity, defend our public services, Redistribute our wealth, let the rich pay. Cancel public debt created by the financial crisis, like countries Greece, Spain. Oh. Defend democracy, break with trade and fiscal pacts, which limits it. Unify the environmental struggle with the social struggles. Organize, mobilize, and meet the confrontation. That's it. Then we can create situations like this. Madrid, 22nd of March this year. Millions of people in Madrid, initiated by social movements. Only 2 days before, Comisiones Obreras, the once very proud and strong communist-oriented trade union, joined the demonstration when they understood that it would be big. That is part of the problem we face in Europe. And I've used more than my time. But I've used enough time for the commercial to come. So that is my book.
Thank you very much, Bill and Asbjørn. It's very interesting, so we got right thrown into it with analysis and a very broad picture of capitalism, anti-capitalism, and trade union movement. And I think you raised a few questions and you put forward a few ideas, or in terms of analysis, what went wrong, the big question, and all the challenges that are ahead of us. What do we have to do with our unions, and how do we have to get more, demand more, get more, and refocus and restructure our unions, and then the emphasis on politicizing our unions and the workers again, so that we can achieve more. So I think that's a lot to discuss in discussion groups, also to see whether this matches with your experience and with your ideas. And I'll just ask if there is an urgent question in terms of understanding something they said, and then we'll break up into the discussion group. So we won't discuss here. If you have an urgent question in terms of understanding something, or you're not sure you understood something they said, you can ask them then. Okay, Jojo?
No, I don't have a question. I think both presentations were really good. But I think what we also need to incorporate the views from the South.
Yeah.
Because while the welfare state is the main product of the labor movement in Europe, we've never had any form of welfare state in the South. And that means that to a large extent, the crisis of the labor movement in the South is also, while we did have welfare state, the crisis of the labor movement in the South I think the crisis in the labor movement in the South is also coming from its own historical problems. And I cannot speak obviously for the entire Asia. It's so complicated, so diverse for me to generalize. But in the Philippines, the very birth of the labor movement that came from the liberation struggles of the working class against Spain, with a very strong nationalist narrative, and which was then entwined with the socialist ideals that came from the elites who were exiled in Spain, who were imprisoned in Spain, who got to know the anarchists in the prisons. Then they got back to the Philippines and they merged the anarchist thinking with the nationalist thinking in the Philippines. I think that the roots of the problem also would come from its own history, because with nationalism, for that nationalism is a problem. I think in my country, there is still many left people in the Philippines who would still defend the idea that there is a good nationalism and a bad nationalism, like there's chauvinist nationalism, and there's this pretty useful nationalism. I've never been a fan of that analysis, because I've always think that has weighed down the movement for a very long time. So, but there are other sources of crisis Part of which, of course, is the very economic nature of a dependency capitalist that we have. Not to mention that we still have this huge feudal structure in many parts of Asia. So I said, as I'm saying, there's so many crises, there's so many sources of crises that I think doesn't capture what we've heard here.
So, okay. How are you?
Discussion has started.
Okay, what we're going to do is I'll take these 4 people and I'll give you the opportunity to answer or to report some more ideas, and then we're going to break. Okay, so I'll take you first.
Yes, Peter Damo from Romania. I'm from the Federation of Independent Trade Unions in Education, which has been recently formed. And I would just like to support in a somewhat particular manner what our colleague from the Philippines has just said. I think that this idea of including the Global South in the analysis applies quite very well to Central and Eastern European states, because the same way we have never experienced a social welfare state. Apart from that, we have seen the same impact and assault of the neoliberal attacks recently. But anyway, the analysis should go on a different path, because the explanations are somewhat different than the ones you have given for your situation in the Global South. So it's somewhat a different situation, which is historically and politically related to the downfall of quotation marks former Soviet and communist quotation marks bloc, where as those who are acquainted with this know that you have a unique party system, and you have attached to that unique party system a unique trade union bloc, which, for instance, in Romania it was Uniunea Gimnastică in Romania. It goes, it reads like the general trade union of trade unions in Romania. But this was a sort of an appendix of the Communist Party. So when the system broke down, it broke down the attachment as well, quotation marks, and this is how the analysis should be conducted. But of course, I think we should take this into account, because the same way I emphasize this, I take this back again, as you never had a social welfare state, we have never had it. So then the analysis should not be restricted just to the Western part of the globe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so they right at the back.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very gentle from Juliet in South Africa. I'm tempted to, I don't know if this comes from the Boon Show, but the old thing of what about the workers? You know, there's a sense in our analysis that we presume this project, this question of revival, emancipation, is a trade union issue. And we're not even putting at the center, have trade unions not become part of the problem, structurally, and not part of the solution. I mean, Bill's analysis, beautiful analysis of the state nature of the ruling. Nobody's looking at the neoliberalism as a fundamental defeat of the working class that has occurred over 30 years and reconfigured the working class beyond anything they might have imagined if you're over 30 years old in this room. And nobody's tracking that, and whether the trade union forms, which are largely product of something that existed 100 years ago, have any correspondence with what the working class looks like, acts, and does today. And therefore, if we're looking at a project of possible emancipation, new ideas of the way forward, why do we privilege the trade unions in that? Now, maybe there's a program of self-reform of the trade unions, and many people love the trade union, that can try and capture that. Maybe, but let's debate that. Alternatively, we need to place the lens elsewhere. Other initiatives that are emerging amongst the working class. Other new forms of organizing that are emerging there. And is it the process of engaging that and rethinking things completely differently? Or is there some project of self-reform within the labor movement of the trade union itself? That's the kind of debate I'd like us to put at the center.
Okay,
And that's
Thank you
not
very
in the
much.
south of
Thank you very much. I'm sure we're going to follow up all this all during the week. Okay, there was. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Khalid from Labour Education Foundation in Pakistan. I think we also need to discuss how capitalism has used wars to further its agenda, starting from Iraq, the whole Arab Spring and the aftermath. And recently, with the coalition with the Saudi capitalism, what is happening in Syria. I mean, we all are very happy to be against the regime there. What is happening there? But what is the agenda of the US capitalism and Saudi coalition and all that is happening in the region? The same things happened in Afghanistan. What we have faced in Pakistan during the first first Afghan war in Soviet Union, how military dictatorships were supported at that time, and even now some dictatorships are being supported. So these things are also, I think, part of this this system, capitalist system, where people are being killed, and the policy of control over the resources. And in all that scenario, the working class movements are being suppressed by the dictators or the so-called democratic governments in our country. So these things, I think, are also very important, and in the big region of the world, these policies are.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kate. So I think now we're going to stop. So, as I said before, I was just looking for. I'll give you.
Sorry, should I just make she had her hand up.
The fourth. She was the fourth.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Thanks a lot.
because it's also
Yeah.
3 men.
Okay. No, thanks a lot. I was actually looking for the fourth person. Okay, so I'll give you time to speak.
My name is Dia. I'm from Indonesia, Interfactory Labor Union. I want to ask how far the development of alternative now to fight against capitalism, which is in crisis, when the workers is disappointed with their own position, and also the rise of fascism and conservative in the Europe. I also want to share that now in Indonesia, fascism also rising, in which Prabowo, the son-in-law of Suharto's regime, become the candidate of president, and the supporters are many people support him, including metal workers, SPMI, which is the strongest trade union in Indonesia. Only because Prabowo signed the contracts with the workers that he will raise the minimum wage. The workers have a statement that no matter what his background, although he is a fascist, he is an anti-democratic person, because he signed the contract, it's okay. That's the problem of ideology, maybe about they don't care about the democracy space. I think that's all. Maybe you can share. Thank you.
So I'll give you briefly the opportunity to react or answer, and then we'll break up.
Maybe after the discussion groups.
Or after discussion.
Yeah. Two small points.
Two small points, and Bill, 2 small points.
You have raised so many important and difficult questions, so I think most of them have to go into the discussion groups. But I want to make 2 points. One thing is, I was very glad that you took up the South, the developing countries and so on, because not only for what you said, but also because the exploitation of the third world was part of the financing of the welfare states of the North, and that should also be included, of course, when we consider that. Another thing which I think is important is that even in the South, even in many developing countries, they turn into sort of social partnership ideology, the trade unions. And one of the reasons for it is that all the help, so-called, you receive from our unions, from our confederations, from the ETUC and all that, they go to Africa, to Asia, to Central and Eastern Europe, and try to teach them how to become good in social dialogue. And I always say to my friends in this country, when Norwegian and European unions come to you and offer you that help, send them home.
Don't forget Gompers, the exportation of Gompers to the Philippines.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just a couple of few things. One is I think that part of what you were describing in terms of the crisis in the Global South is related to the crisis of the national populist project, within which there's this element of the union's relationship to national liberation struggles, independence movements, things like that. The second, and I'm actually obsessed with this question of the legitimacy of the state, because whether you're in the global north or the global south, the inability or unwillingness of much of the left to address this question has left open tremendous space for the rise of these right-wing populist movements, and for sometimes these very bizarre collaborations between the left and the right. You saw that in Eastern Europe, and you've seen that in other parts of the global South. And yes, comrade, I actually do privilege the unions. I know that's probably not the right thing to say, right? I believe that the unions have such an essential role in fighting off barbarism if they are in fact reconfigured. I think that fundamentally we are at what they call in another setting an extinction moment, right? At which point unions may in fact cease to exist. I don't think that there are other social movements that exist out there that can replace them. That's not a criticism of the social movements. There's a particular role that unions can play, and under the right kind of leadership, and that's actually why I'm at this event, right? This program, because I believe that in working with other people who are committed to a labor renaissance, we have a chance of avoiding that extinction moment, but only a chance.
Okay, I know you would like to say lots of things now, but I think it's good to break up into groups. I'm here for the third time. I fully share what you just said. It's a very good event, and I can assure you, last 2 times we had enough time to tackle all the questions in all 4.5 days. So I think we'll be able to do this week. So I'll hand it over to you, Dave, to break up in discussion groups. We'll be back here 4 to 2.
Yes, I think that's right.